The courtroom buzzed with the usual rhythm of a busy morning. The shuffle of papers, the murmur of attorneys and defendants, and the occasional clink of a gavel striking. Judge Robert Stanton, his glasses perched at the end of his nose, scanned the list of cases before him. He'd seen it all before: traffic violations, petty misdemeanors, cases where the outcomes seemed almost predetermined. He prided himself on efficiency, rarely letting anything or anyone distract him from the task at hand. Maya Williams stood at the front, her posture straight, hands clasped together. She wasn't in military attire today, but her presence was striking nonetheless. Her sharp features, composed demeanor, and direct gaze gave her an air of someone accustomed to higher stakes. But today, in this small courtroom, she was simply another person facing the judge's decision. "Miss Williams," Judge Stanton began, his voice firm but indifferent, "you've been cited for failing to stop at a red light. Is there anything you wish to say before I issue a ruling?" Maya opened her mouth, ready to explain that she was rushing to a meeting, one of many that day, and that the light had been more of a cautionary suggestion than a hard stop. But she stopped herself. She knew better than to try to explain too much in a courtroom where time seemed to move faster than justice. Instead, she gave a respectful nod and said simply, "No, Your Honor. I understand." Judge Stanton, a man who prided himself on swift justice, glanced at his notes. He barely registered the name in front of him, despite the fact that Maya had been highly recommended for her work in the armed forces and her efforts in military justice reform. Her name didn't mean much to him, not in this moment. It was just another case, one that he would handle like any other. "Very well. I'm fining you $250 for the infraction," the judge declared, his gavel striking down as the decision was made. "Court is adjourned." Maya didn't flinch. She accepted the fine without protest, knowing that it wasn't worth fighting in this space. The courtroom felt colder now, and as she left the stand, she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence and her work hadn't been seen, only judged. As she walked toward the exit, her thoughts lingered on the encounter. She had spent years advocating for the kind of fairness and consideration that she believed the justice system could offer. But in this small moment, her work seemed distant, overshadowed by an immediate decision that didn't ask any deeper questions. Maya's resolve hardened. She had been dismissed in the very place where justice was meant to be blind to bias. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a far more unexpected journey. Maya Williams hadn't always known the path she would walk, but she had always known the importance of fairness. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, she'd faced her share of challenges. As a child, her dreams were often dismissed by others, mostly because she didn't fit the mold of what society expected from someone like her. She was quiet, driven, and stubbornly focused on her education. Her mother, a single parent working 2 jobs, instilled in her the belief that education was the key to overcoming any obstacle. Despite the odds stacked against her, Maya excelled in school. She was one of the few students of color in her class, and while her peers celebrated her intelligence, she often found herself battling stereotypes and subtle biases. But rather than let these experiences shape her negatively, Maya used them as fuel to prove she belonged. Her ambition wasn't just for herself. It was for others who might be overlooked for reasons beyond their control. By the time she was 18, Maya enlisted in the U.S. military. It was a decision that surprised many of her peers and family members. The military, in her eyes, represented structure, discipline, and the possibility of making a difference on a larger scale. What she hadn't anticipated, however, was how deeply ingrained the challenges of race and gender would be even in this institution, built on principles of unity and service. The first few years were difficult. She was often one of the few women of color in her unit, and those who rose to leadership roles were predominantly white and male. Yet Maya's determination to succeed was unwavering. She trained harder, learned faster, and kept her focus on one goal: to change the system from within. Over time, Maya's impact began to grow. She earned respect for her ability to navigate the complexities of military life while simultaneously advocating for her peers, particularly those who, like her, felt marginalized. She founded initiatives that addressed inequality in promotions and advancement opportunities. Maya wasn't just a soldier. She was a voice for reform, a fierce advocate for the voiceless who lacked the platform to make their concerns heard. Her efforts quickly gained attention beyond her immediate superiors. Her initiatives began influencing policy changes, from improving the recruitment process for underrepresented communities to advocating for a more inclusive environment in military training. Maya's name began to circulate in military circles as someone whose influence extended far beyond her uniform. She was soon invited to conferences, where her speeches inspired countless others to challenge the norms and work toward a military that truly embodied the ideals of equality. Yet, despite all the progress she had made, Maya never stopped being aware of the subtle prejudices that still lurked in the background. Even in spaces where she had proven herself time and time again, her success was often undermined by others who saw her as an exception rather than the rule. She had learned to push forward anyway, driven not by recognition, but by the belief that the work she did mattered, more than anything else. And it was this unshakable conviction that would ultimately lead her into the courtroom that day. As Maya's career in the military progressed, her influence grew exponentially. By her mid-30s, she had become a well-respected leader, not just in her unit, but across several branches of the armed forces. Her work wasn't just about ensuring fairness for herself. It was about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of background, could rise based on their abilities and merits. One of her most significant accomplishments was the establishment of a mentorship program aimed at supporting women of color who enlisted in the military. Maya recognized that, while recruitment numbers had improved, retention was another matter entirely. Too many talented individuals fell through the cracks due to a lack of guidance or support. Her program matched young recruits with experienced mentors, providing advice, guidance, and a community of support that helped bridge the gap between aspiration and achievement. Her efforts didn't stop there. Maya was instrumental in launching a comprehensive review of the military's promotion system, advocating for more transparent processes that would prevent favoritism and bias. She worked tirelessly to ensure that those who had earned their rank through hard work and dedication were not overlooked for opportunities because of their race, gender, or background. Her tireless advocacy led to policy changes that would shape the military for years to come. But Maya's work wasn't always met with universal approval. While many admired her courage and drive, others in the military hierarchy were uncomfortable with the changes she was pushing for. These were the same voices who believed that tradition should not be questioned, that the military's long-standing practices were beyond reproach. They viewed her as a disruptor, someone who was shaking up a system that had worked for generations. Despite the pushback, Maya remained undeterred. She had seen firsthand the ways in which systemic inequalities could hold people back, and she wasn't willing to let the status quo define the future. She kept pushing, using her position to challenge the institution from the inside out. Her efforts were noticed beyond the military. Various government agencies and advocacy organizations began to reach out, asking her to speak at conferences, write articles, and participate in high-level discussions on diversity and inclusion. Maya had become a figurehead for justice, not only in the military but across industries. She had become a voice for those who didn't have one, someone who understood the weight of systemic discrimination and was willing to fight it on every front. She spoke with grace, but also with an undeniable fierceness. People listened. Maya had learned how to navigate the intricacies of institutional power, and in doing so, she was able to push for meaningful reforms that would affect generations of military personnel to come. But even with all her accomplishments, Maya knew that her work was far from over. The system still had its cracks, and there were many more battles to fight. She was determined to keep pushing forward, never forgetting the struggles of those who had been left behind, and never losing sight of the ultimate goal: a more just and equitable military. Judge Robert Stanton had always believed in order, an order that he had spent decades honing through his career. Born into a family of esteemed legal professionals, he followed in their footsteps with pride. His father had been a judge, his grandfather a renowned attorney, and the weight of their legacy was something Stanton carried with him every day. He saw the law as an unshakable structure, a foundation that kept society from descending into chaos. To him, the courtroom was a place where rules mattered most, where personal experiences and emotions had little space to interfere with the facts at hand. Stanton's daily routine was one of strict efficiency. He prided himself on never letting a case run longer than necessary. His courtroom was methodical, predictable, and devoid of sentimentality. Every day, he followed a clear script. Read the facts, issue the ruling, and move on. In this world, people were often reduced to their charges, their personal stories irrelevant to the cold logic of the law. He had seen thousands of defendants come and go, most of them simply names on a docket, not individuals with complex lives or stories. His reputation was built on a no-nonsense approach to justice, and he was respected, if not always liked, by those in the legal community. His rulings were often seen as unwavering, never straying from the letter of the law. He didn't allow personal biases or emotions to cloud his judgment. In Stanton's world, the law was sacred, and his interpretation of it was absolute. But as the years passed, Stanton began to notice subtle shifts in the atmosphere around him. The legal world was changing, and so were the people who entered his courtroom. He could no longer ignore the conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion that had begun to permeate the legal profession and society at large. At first, he brushed them off. The law, after all, was neutral. It didn't need to be influenced by the cultural debates outside the courtroom. In his view, the system was fair if you followed the rules, and if you didn't, you were simply held accountable. But there were moments, fleeting yet undeniable, when Stanton found himself questioning whether he was seeing the whole picture. In cases involving racial disparities or gender discrimination, he'd seen some of his peers struggle with decisions that felt uncomfortable, even though the law supported their rulings. Stanton didn't share their doubts. His approach had always been clear-cut. Justice was about adherence to the rules, not the complexities of societal inequities. Still, he couldn't escape the nagging thought that perhaps, just perhaps, the world outside the courtroom was shifting in a way that might require him to rethink his rigid sense of justice. It was a thought that he kept to himself, buried beneath the weight of years spent in the pursuit of certainty and control. Little did he know, the moment Maya Williams stepped into his courtroom that morning would spark a shift in him he could not have anticipated. Her case, seemingly just another routine fine, was about to challenge everything he thought he knew about justice. Maya's encounter in Judge Stanton's courtroom, though seemingly ordinary at the time, quickly spiraled into something much bigger. Within hours, local news outlets were buzzing with her name. A woman of her caliber being fined for something as trivial as a traffic violation didn't sit right with the public, especially given the growing recognition of her work in the military. Stories of Maya's contributions to the armed forces, her leadership, her advocacy for diversity, and her tireless fight for justice were widely shared. It wasn't long before the media picked up on the striking contrast. The woman who had changed the lives of so many in the military world had been dismissed in a courtroom with little more than a glance and a fine. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Social media exploded with messages of support for Maya, and many questioned whether the fine had been a result of bias or simple disregard for her contributions. Was the judge aware of who he had fined? Was this really just a case of oversight, or had Maya's reputation been overlooked entirely? Her supporters, especially those in military and advocacy circles, rallied behind her. Maya's advocacy for racial justice within the military had made her a beacon of hope for many who felt voiceless, and the thought that someone like her could be dismissed so easily by the legal system struck a chord with people far beyond her immediate circle. Many questioned whether this reflected a broader issue. Was the legal system still entrenched in outdated, narrow views of who deserved respect and attention? Maya, however, stayed calm. Despite the influx of attention, she refused to make this about herself. Her focus was still on her mission, to ensure the changes she fought for in the military would not be overshadowed by individual biases or systemic issues. This case was simply another example of the fight that still lay ahead, she thought. The fine didn't matter much to her, but the discussion it had sparked, that was what truly mattered. She knew this moment could be leveraged to push the conversation about fairness in both the military and the legal system. While Maya's attention was on the future, the story was slowly making its way into the mind of Judge Stanton. He had heard about the uproar, but hadn't thought much of it at first. After all, it was just a routine case, wasn't it? He had imposed the fine based on the letter of the law, and that was supposed to be enough. But as the days passed, Stanton couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't sit right. He started hearing more about Maya, her background, her tireless advocacy, her position as a key player in the military's efforts toward greater inclusion and equality. Articles that once seemed like distant, irrelevant stories began to feel more personal. As Stanton researched her work, he came to realize just how significant Maya was, not just in her role in the military, but in shaping conversations about justice and equality in the broader world. This wasn't just a fine for a traffic violation. This was a moment that had inadvertently exposed the gulf between how justice was perceived and how it was actually applied. The judge's world, once so clear-cut and neat, now felt a little more complicated. Maya's name lingered in his mind, and with it, an undeniable sense of discomfort. Would he have treated her differently if he had known who she was? Would he have made the same decision if he had considered her work, her influence, and her contributions to justice in a broader context? The thought unsettled him. And for the first time in years, he wondered if the world outside his courtroom should affect the way he viewed the law. As the days went by, Judge Stanton couldn't shake the nagging discomfort that had settled in his mind. What had seemed like just another day in court was beginning to feel like something much more significant. The story of Maya Williams continued to echo in the media, drawing attention not just for the fine itself, but for the larger implications of her work and her reputation. The judge, a man who had prided himself on his impartiality and his strict adherence to the law, found himself wrestling with the growing realization that perhaps his decision had been too hasty. It began with a simple search. Judge Stanton, in the privacy of his office, typed Maya Williams' name into a search engine. At first, it was just a few articles, short summaries about her career, her military service, and her advocacy work. But as he dug deeper, the scope of her influence became increasingly apparent. He read about the mentorship programs she'd helped establish for women of color in the military, the policy reforms she had championed, and the numerous speeches and panels where her voice had been a force for change. Maya wasn't just an advocate for justice in the military. She was a leader in the broader conversation about fairness and equality. The more Stanton read, the more uneasy he felt. Here was a woman who had given so much of herself to her country, who had fought for equality in an institution that had historically struggled with diversity. She was a trailblazer, respected not only by her peers, but by senior officials who had seen firsthand the positive impact of her work. And yet, in his courtroom, she had been reduced to a name on a docket, a defendant with a simple infraction. No context, no recognition of the life she had built, or the difference she was making. Stanton found himself replaying the court session in his mind. Maya had been respectful, dignified, but her calm demeanor in the face of the fine now felt almost tragic. Had he overlooked her for who she truly was? Was his decision based solely on the facts of the case, or had his biases, however subtle, played a role in how he treated her? In a quiet, unsettling way, Stanton began to acknowledge that his belief in a rigid, impersonal interpretation of the law might have been incomplete. A thought struck him, unbidden. What if Maya had been someone else? What if she weren't a woman of color, an advocate for justice, but instead someone with a less visible background? Would he have acted the same way? Would he have been so quick to issue a fine without considering the broader context of the individual standing before him? The realization stung. Stanton had always prided himself on treating everyone the same, on delivering justice without prejudice. But now he had to confront the uncomfortable truth that his blind spots, his assumptions about people, especially those who didn't fit the mold, had led him to make a decision that felt more out of touch with the world he was supposed to serve than he was willing to admit. Judge Stanton sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the gravity of his own reckoning. Maya Williams wasn't just a name on a case. She was a symbol of something larger, a living testament to the idea that justice must not only be fair, but also aware, nuanced, and, at times, humble enough to learn and grow. Judge Stanton could no longer ignore the weight of his actions. The more he thought about Maya Williams, the more he recognized how wrong he had been in his quick judgment. The discomfort he had felt grew into something else, a deep sense of responsibility. He had been a figure of authority in the courtroom for years, but now he realized that his decisions had consequences beyond just the legal realm. The law was supposed to serve justice, not only in the letter but in the spirit, and in this case he had failed to do so. After much internal struggle, Stanton made a decision that felt almost foreign to him. He had always handled his rulings with certainty and pride, but now he knew he had to reach out to Maya. Not as a judge issuing another decision, but as a man who had wronged someone and wanted to make it right. With a hesitant hand, Stanton dialed Maya's office number, unsure of what to expect. It rang for a few moments before a calm voice on the other end answered. "Hello, this is Maya Williams," she said. "Miss Williams, this is Judge Robert Stanton," he began, his voice steady but filled with an unfamiliar uncertainty. "I'm calling to discuss the fine I issued to you last week." There was a brief pause on the other end. Maya, having been through her fair share of courtroom interactions, was no stranger to the cold formality of such exchanges. But there was something different in the tone of Stanton's voice. She had expected to hear more of the usual legal jargon, but instead, he sounded thoughtful. "I've spent a great deal of time reflecting on that decision," Stanton continued, "and I've come to realize that I acted without fully understanding who you are and what you stand for. I made a mistake. I owe you an apology." Maya was quiet for a moment, taken aback by the judge's candidness. She hadn't expected this. The judge who had fined her so swiftly now seemed humbled, genuinely remorseful. But Maya knew that actions spoke louder than words. She wasn't sure where this conversation would go, but she appreciated the sincerity in his voice. "I appreciate your apology, Judge Stanton," she replied, her voice measured yet kind. "But I believe this is more than just about me. It's about a larger conversation on how justice is applied, and who gets to define it." Stanton nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "You're right, and that's why I'd like to meet with you. I think we need to have a deeper discussion, not just about your case, but about the work you're doing, and how we, as a society, can better understand justice." Maya considered his words. A part of her was wary. She had seen enough apologies that didn't lead to real change. But there was something in the judge's voice that told her this wasn't just about clearing his conscience. This was an opportunity to open a conversation, one that could lead to real change, not just for her, but for others like her, who had been dismissed or misunderstood. "I'm willing to meet," Maya said finally, "but I hope this isn't just a one-time conversation. We need more than that." Judge Stanton felt a small weight lift from his chest, replaced by a sense of resolve. "I promise you, Miss Williams, this is just the beginning." And so, the first steps toward a new understanding were taken. Both the judge and the advocate were about to embark on a journey that neither could have predicted, one that would change the way they viewed not only each other, but the very system they had both dedicated their lives to. Maya and Judge Stanton met a week later at a small cafe, the kind of place where the conversations were intimate, and the noise of the outside world felt distant. Maya arrived early, her mind swirling with the possibilities of what this meeting could bring. She had seen too many situations where people apologized but didn't change. Was this judge truly open to understanding the systemic issues she had spent her life fighting against? Or was this just another gesture to clear his conscience? When Stanton walked in, his expression was serious but sincere. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Miss Williams," he began, sitting down across from her. "I want to start by acknowledging that I made a mistake, but I also want to hear your perspective. Really hear it, because I've come to realize that the legal system can't function in isolation. It needs to be in touch with the reality outside the courtroom." Maya nodded, appreciating his directness. "I'm glad to hear that, Judge. But it's not just about acknowledging one mistake. It's about understanding why those mistakes happen in the first place, and how we can prevent them. The legal system, like the military, is full of people who are supposed to protect justice. But too often, it's those very systems that are slow to evolve, slow to recognize the ways in which bias, however unintentional, shapes decisions." Stanton listened intently, his eyes focused, his hands resting on the table. He wasn't sure what he had expected from Maya, but it certainly wasn't the clear, methodical approach she was taking to the issue at hand. She wasn't angry, but there was a firmness in her voice that commanded respect. "I've spent years advocating for equality and fairness in the military," Maya continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "And while we've made some progress, the work isn't over. Justice doesn't come from one decision or one initiative. It's a long process, one that requires constant reflection and self-awareness." Stanton's mind began to churn. He had always prided himself on the law's impartiality, but Maya's words had illuminated a crucial point. Impartiality was a fine ideal, but it was too often clouded by assumptions and oversights. The law was not a vacuum, and neither were the people who administered it. He had to do better, not just for Maya, but for every person who walked through his courtroom doors. "So, what do we do now?" Stanton asked, his tone reflective. Maya thought for a moment. "We start by listening. And then, we work to make sure our systems, both military and legal, reflect the diversity and realities of the people they serve. We need more dialogue, more understanding of the nuances that affect the lives of people who are too often marginalized." Stanton leaned back, his mind racing with ideas. "You're right," he admitted. "This isn't just about one case. It's about the broader picture. I want to help with that change. I want to do more than just issue rulings. I want to be part of a system that listens, that adapts." Over the next several months, Maya and Stanton began collaborating on initiatives designed to foster greater awareness and inclusion in both the military and the legal system. They spoke at conferences, hosted panels, and worked together on research projects aimed at improving fairness in military recruitment and legal practices. Their partnership, once improbable, became a symbol of what could happen when two individuals from different worlds came together with a shared vision for change. Their efforts didn't stop at words. They actively worked to create training programs for judges and military leaders alike, focusing on recognizing unconscious biases and embracing a more holistic approach to justice. They advocated for reforms that would ensure that people like Maya, who had given so much to her country, would never again be overlooked in a courtroom. As their collaboration deepened, so did their understanding of one another. Stanton came to appreciate that true justice wasn't just about the law. It was about acknowledging the human stories that existed behind every case. Maya, in turn, recognized that change often started in unexpected places, and that sometimes all it took was one moment of humility to spark a transformation that could reshape the future. Together, they proved that even the most entrenched systems could evolve, one conversation at a time.